The dust of the high plains was a fine, restless powder, a pale ghost that clung to everything. It settled in the creases of Elijah's leather gloves, in the lines around his eyes, and on the brim of his sweat-stained hat. He worked the fence line with a practiced economy of motion, his hands knowing the feel of the wire, the give of the post, the precise force needed to drive a staple home. The land around him was a study in immensity, a canvas of sage and rock under a sky so vast it seemed to hum with emptiness. This was his world, a quiet kingdom of solitude he had carved out with his own 2 hands. He was a man who fit the landscape, weathered and self-sufficient, his silence as deep and natural as the canyons to the west. From his vantage point on the low rise that marked the edge of his property, he could see the dirt road that served as the only artery to the outside world. It was along this road that a cloud of dust, thicker than the usual wind-blown haze, announced an arrival. A rickety wagon, pulled by a tired-looking mule, rattled toward the neighboring plot, a patch of hard land owned by Jedediah Stone. Jed was a man known for his short temper and his sour view of the world, a stark contrast to Elijah's quiet forbearance. Elijah paused his work, leaning against a post, his gaze distant but sharp. He watched as the wagon clattered to a halt before Jed's crude gate. A figure descended, a woman. Even from a distance, she was an incongruous sight. Her dress, a dark blue wool better suited for a city street, was limp with travel and coated in the ubiquitous dust. She carried herself with a rigid pride, her back a straight line against the drooping horizon. Her name was Anna, though Elijah did not know it yet. She stood with a small, sturdy trunk at her feet as Jed climbed down from the wagon seat. Their exchange was brief, but its meaning was carried on the wind as clearly as the scent of sage. Jed's gestures were sharp, dismissive slashes of his arm. Anna's stillness was her only reply. He pointed a finger at her, then swept his arm toward the empty expanse beyond his own property, a gesture of final, brutal severance. He climbed back onto his wagon without a backward glance, snapped the reins and rumbled away, leaving her enveloped in the swirling dust of his departure. For a long time Anna did not move. She was a solitary statue planted in the unforgiving earth, a testament to broken promises. The sun began its slow descent, bleeding orange and purple across the western sky, and the shadows of the bluffs grew long and menacing. Elijah hammered the last staple into place, the sound a sharp, definitive crack in the growing quiet. He coiled his wire, gathered his tools, and began to walk, not toward his cabin, but toward the figure silhouetted by the dying light. He did not take his horse, a deliberate choice to appear less intimidating, to meet her on equal ground. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace. She watched his approach, her body tensing, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. He stopped a respectful distance away, the space between them filled with the chirping of crickets and the weight of her predicament. He offered his canteen. "Water," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but calm. She looked at the canteen, then at his face. She saw no pity there, only a plain acknowledgement of fact. She took it, her hand brushing his for a fleeting moment, and drank deeply. She handed it back with a silent nod of thanks. He did not ask what had happened. The scene had told him everything he needed to know. "Night comes on fast," he said, his eyes scanning the darkening hills. "Coyotes will be singing soon. The next town is 2 days' walk. Longer, if you don't know the way." He paused, letting the truth of his words settle. "I have a cabin. There's shelter. A roof." Anna's gaze was scrutinizing. She had been deceived once today by a man's promise. She searched Elijah's face for any sign of guile, any hint of expectation. She saw only the steady, clear eyes of a man who stated things as they were. The land, the night, the danger, they were all true. Her pride was a poor shield against the coming cold. She gave another single, sharp nod. It was all the answer he needed. He bent down, lifted her heavy trunk to his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and turned. He started walking toward the small, dark shape of a cabin nestled against a rise, its windows beginning to glow faintly with the last light of the day. Anna hesitated for only a second before falling into step behind him, their two lonely figures swallowed by the vast, encroaching twilight. The cabin was a single room, but it was meticulously kept. The scent of wood smoke and leather hung in the air. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers still glowing softly. A sturdy table with two chairs stood in the center, and a single bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, was tucked into a corner. There was a quiet order to the space that spoke of its owner. Without a word, Elijah gestured to the bed. He then took a thick wool blanket from a chest and laid it out for himself on the floor near the hearth. Anna watched him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. This simple, unspoken act of decency was a balm on the raw wound of her day. She slept fitfully, the strange silence of the plains a stark contrast to the city noise she had always known. When she woke, the cabin was filled with the gray light of dawn. Elijah was already outside. She could hear the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. A tin pot of coffee was warming on the hearth, and a plate with 2 pieces of hardtack bread sat on the table. They ate in a shared silence that was not awkward, but contemplative. The unasked question of her future was a third presence in the room, but he did not voice it. After their meal, he simply put on his hat and went back outside to his chores. Anna was left in the quiet cabin, a guest with no host to entertain and no destination to depart for. The feeling of idleness, of charity, was a weight she could not bear. She saw a worn broom leaning against the doorframe. She picked it up and began to sweep the porch, her movements stiff at first, then more certain. It was a small act, but it was work. It was a claim on the day. This unspoken arrangement became their life. He would rise with the sun, tend to his small herd of cattle, repair what needed mending, and work the unforgiving soil. She, in turn, began to impose her own quiet order on the domestic sphere. Behind the cabin, she discovered a fallow patch of earth protected from the wind by a rock ledge. It had once been a garden. She found Elijah sharpening a tool by the barn. "If I had seeds," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I could make a garden." He looked at the patch of dirt, then back at her. The next day, after a trip to the distant general store, a small collection of paper packets appeared on the table. Beans, squash, corn, and carrots. He had also brought a small spade and a watering can. He left them there without comment. Anna began her work. She broke the hard, dry ground, her hands, once accustomed to needle and thread, quickly becoming acquainted with the sting of blisters and the grit of the soil. The garden became her dominion, a small square of hope in the vast wilderness. It was a place where she could pour her resilience, her pragmatism, her silent and desperate need to make something grow. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. They spoke little, but their shared space filled with a language of gestures. He would return from his work to find the cabin clean, a simple meal of beans and cornbread waiting on the table. He once left a single, vibrant Indian paintbrush on her pillow. She, in turn, noticed a tear in his work shirt and mended it with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. One evening, as she served him stew, a faint smile touched her lips. "From the garden," she said softly. He looked at the bits of carrot and onion in his bowl, and a corresponding smile creased the corners of his eyes. "It's good," he said, and the simple compliment held the weight of a sonnet. They were 2 solitary people learning to orbit one another, their gravity a gentle, steady pull. He taught her the names of the constellations one clear, cold night, his voice a low rumble as he pointed out the hunter and the Great Bear. "The city had no stars," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the diamond-dusted sky. Only a glow. It was the first piece of her past she had offered him, a small, polished stone from the ruins of her old life. He accepted it with a quiet nod, understanding that what she was really saying was that she had never seen the world so clearly before. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, a shared history forged in the daily work of survival. Months bled one into the next, the fierce heat of summer ripening the land. The small garden behind the cabin was no longer a patch of dirt but a riot of green life. The corn stood tall, its tassels heavy with pollen, and the squash vines snaked across the ground, their broad leaves sheltering plump, yellow fruit. Anna's hands were no longer soft. They were strong and capable, her skin browned by the sun. A comfortable, established rhythm governed their lives. A quiet partnership that had never been negotiated, but was as solid as the rock foundation of the cabin. One late afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple. The air grew heavy and still, the birdsong silenced. A storm was coming, one of the violent, sudden tempests that could tear across the plains without warning. Elijah was in the corral, securing the gate, when the first crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The horses, placid moments before, exploded into a panic, their eyes wide with terror. They bucked and crashed against the wooden rails. Elijah moved among them, his voice a low, calming murmur, trying to gentle them. Another bolt of lightning, closer this time, struck a tall pine on the ridge. The flash was blinding. One of the horses, a powerful gelding, reared high, its front hooves lashing out. A top rail of the fence splintered under the force, a jagged piece of wood swinging down and catching Elijah across the thigh before he could move away. He crumpled to the ground, a sharp cry torn from his lips. Anna saw it all from the cabin window. Without a flicker of hesitation, she pulled a heavy shawl over her head and ran out into the maelstrom. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs, and the rain came in horizontal sheets, plastering her hair to her face. She was not afraid. She plunged into the chaos of the corral, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the noise of the storm and the panic of the animals. Following Elijah's gasped instructions, she maneuvered her body, using the shawl to wave and guide, her presence a surprising, steady force. Together, they drove the terrified horses into the relative safety of the small barn. Only then did she turn to him. He was trying to stand, his face pale and grim with pain. She put her shoulder under his arm, taking on his weight, and half-dragged, half-carried him through the mud and driving rain back to the shelter of the cabin. His leg was laid open, a deep, bleeding gash in the muscle. She worked with a focused calm that seemed to hold the storm at bay. She tore strips from a clean linen sheet, washed the wound with boiled water and soap, and bandaged it with a firm, practiced hand. For the first time since she had arrived, their roles were reversed. He was the one who was vulnerable, and she was the one who was strong, the provider of care and comfort. He was laid up for nearly a week. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Anna ran the homestead alone. She rose before the sun to milk their single cow, feed the horses, and chop the wood. She tended to Elijah's wound, changing the dressing daily. She cooked and cleaned and worked her garden, her competence a quiet, powerful revelation. In the long, quiet hours of his convalescence, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. The cabin, which had once felt so vast and empty, now felt intimate, filled with the soft sounds of her movements and the low murmur of their sparse conversations. One evening, as she knelt by his bed to check the bandage, the lamplight cast a warm glow on her face, illuminating the determined line of her jaw and the gentle curve of her cheek. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "Anna," he said, his voice soft, breaking the comfortable silence. She looked up, her hands stilling. "I saw him," he continued, his gaze steady. "I saw Jedediah leave you at the gate." He paused, letting the memory hang in the air between them. "I've thanked God for it every day since her breath caught in her throat. This place," he went on, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "It was just a piece of land, just a roof. You made it a home. I want you to stay, not as a guest, not as help." He struggled for the right words, his honesty raw and direct. "I want you to stay as my wife." Tears welled in Anna's eyes, blurring the image of his earnest face. She thought of the life she had fled, the crowded orphanage, the desperate hope pinned on a stranger's letter. She had been searching not for a husband, but for a place to put down roots, a chance to build something that was hers. She had thought she was buying a future, only to be discarded like unwanted baggage. And yet, Here, in this remote and silent place, she had found it. She had built it with her own 2 hands, in the soil of her garden and in the quiet spaces of this man's heart. Her answer was not a word. Words felt too small for the magnitude of the moment. She leaned forward, her hand coming up to cup his unshaven cheek, and pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss that held no desperation, no fire of sudden passion, but the deep, resonant warmth of earned peace. It was a kiss of acceptance, a seal on a promise that had been growing between them as slowly and surely as the corn in the field. Weeks later, the first chill of autumn was in the air. Elijah walked with a slight limp, a faint scar on his leg the only reminder of the storm. He stood with Anna at the edge of the garden. The harvest was in, the shelves inside the cabin lined with jars of preserved beans and squash, the air rich with the scent of drying herbs. The setting sun painted the vast sky in strokes of fiery crimson and soft gold. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, a comfortable distance between them that was not a distance at all. He looked from her face to the thriving land that stretched out before them. His land, his home. She followed his gaze, seeing not an empty wilderness, but a place of profound and beautiful belonging. It was her home now, too. They had found what few people ever do, a love that had not been declared in poems or promises, but had been cultivated in shared silence, in the turning of the soil, and in the steady, unspoken rhythm of 2 solitary hearts learning to beat as one.